Now, creativity and innovation are concepts that lead to tech breakthroughs, such as the internet, but their very success could threaten their future. My next guest says information technology could end up under monopolistic control, stifling innovation. Tim Wu is a professor at Columbia Law School, a leading proponent of so-called net neutrality. He's also the author of the new book, The Master Switch: The Rise and Fall of Information Empires. Tim, good to have you with us on Bloomberg.
It's a great pleasure.
First of all, why is the book called The Master Switch?
Well, it comes from something Fred Friendly once said. He said, you know, in media markets, it doesn't matter the First Amendment, censorship. None of that really matters. What matters is who controls the master switch.
And Fred Friendly, working at CBS
News,
with Edward R. Murrow. And he was really one of the people that looked at television and saw a landscape that was a little bit troubling at times.
Yeah, well, he had this incident that changed his life, Fred Friendly, where CBS News decided to go with I Love Lucy over Vietnam War hearings. And he said, that's it. This is what it's all about. Whoever controls the master switch has the real control in this situation.
Now, you talk about control, and one of the big figures in the master switch was the gentleman who was in control of the Bell system of, at that time, AT&T, Theodore Vail. And you begin the book by describing a meeting that took place in Washington, D.C. in 1916. It was more than a meeting. It was a dinner.
Right, sure.
And can you just describe why you start at the Willard Hotel in 1916? Why is that a good place for people to kind of get grounded?
Well, people may not think that, you know, the AT&T monopoly would be of much relevance today. But in 1960, you had Theodore Vail, the greatest president of the greatest phone company in the world, meeting with the federal government and effectively planning on what they were going to do to wire America for the future. And their decision, effectively, in all their speeches, was, we're going to give Bell, one company, complete monopoly control over the telephone. In exchange, they're going to wire America and be a good citizen. And so it sets the stage for seeing how federal power and informational power have always been hand in hand.
And you talk about something called the cycle and how there is a difference between how companies that market and sell information, they're different than companies that make things or deal in specific commodities. What is the cycle?
Well, the cycle, first of all, is in every information market, you tend to see a repeated pattern of these very open, very entrepreneurial periods, like the internet in the 90s or now, the radio in the 20s, film in the 10s, where there's hundreds of companies involved and so forth, and it's very open, utopian, and then they always turn into a situation of monopolistic or cartel control. In every single one of those bright young industries of the 20th century, each became the old media of the 21st century. So the cycle is the repetition between open and closed media markets.
Now, one of the other points that you make in the book has to do with Henry Ford and his contention that, you know, competition can create chaos. That's not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, that's true. In the turn of the century, last century, many people thought competition was a bad idea. They thought too chaotic, too crazy, you know, too much trouble. Now, we might think that sounds like, you know, they were just in another era. But look around at the internet today. We have Facebook, absolute monopoly over social networking. Google owns search. We're in an era where having a lot of monopolies, and apparently people actually quite like them. And so we don't say competition's bad, but as consumers, a lot of people do choose monopoly.
And they do choose monopoly that ends up coming with a price tag.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Monopoly always ends up with this price tag, that's true, but just look at consumer behavior. In information markets, people patronize monopolists. So the idea so people looked at this 100 years ago and said, well, monopoly's better. I don't think we think that anymore. But as consumers, people certainly go towards the monopolists. I'll tell you that much.
Now, not only consumers, but the people that control large enterprises. For example, Radio Corporation of America, RCA, David Sarnoff, he actually worked to gain certain technology at the same time that he was criticizing it.
Yeah, David Sarnoff is this fascinating figure. He's essentially the founder of NBC. And so the first man to use economies of scale on radio and broadcasting, one of the pioneers of broadcasting. And what he did, he was not the only person. He was one of the people who realized that this obscure amateur technology could be useful to send one message to millions of people at the same time.
And that means that you could make a lot of money doing so.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's the man who invented the concept of entertainment that sells, which was the sort of founding concept of NBC, CBS, ABC for decades. And in partnership with the government, That was the only show in town for decades. The question is whether those same patterns are reestablishing themselves today.
Tim, this idea that information companies are different, not just because they traffic in information,
right,
but because of the power of the people that run them.
Yeah, you know, from studying the history carefully, I feel there's something very different about the men who want to run information companies, and they're always men. And they're not as interested in money as most businessmen or mere luxury. They're interested in power over people's minds. They are people who have the will to find, Joseph Schumpeter, the economist, said, they are men who want to own a private kingdom. And you can see this with all the men in the book, whether it's Theodore Vail, David Sarnoff, the early leaders of the Hollywood film studios.
Zucker, for example.
They are men who wanted to be great. And the thing that is offered in an information company is not just the ability to make money, but really to have a power over people's minds. Once I interviewed Jerry Levine, formerly of Time, and he said, every morning I woke up and I asked my assistant, how many people did we touch today? We called it touch points. And I think that has a lure which is really irresistible for a certain kind of person.
Connect the work and history that you did for the book to what's going on right now, because you also talk about it, the internet and Steve Jobs and the dominance
Steve
of
Jobs
Apple.
is a fascinating figure because he follows exactly and is taking Apple Computers, or Apple Inc., exactly on the model of every information empire in American history. He is integrating, putting together all the pieces, whether it's Hollywood, AT&T, his own phones, the iPad, putting it all together, creating a beautiful product, and having and exercising absolute control over every single aspect of the product. He is a man who wants to control or have absolute control over what your experience is. And it's a good experience, but it is all about Apple control.
And what about companies like Google? Because you mentioned Facebook as being the dominant force in social media. Google has got to be a role in this.
Google is a lot like AT&T circa 1915. They have promised the public, we will do no evil. In exchange, they've been entrusted with this, what is essentially a public resource at this point. The search engine, everyone uses it. Everyone depends on it. And our public trust in them depends on that do no evil phrase, exactly as with AT&T in 1915. In other words, I think the American people tolerate a monopoly in search because they trust the company. The moment that changes, the moment it ends.
Now, there's another phrase in the book which I thought stood out, which is from Vint Cerf, and it has to do with permissionless innovation.
Yes.
What is that?
Well, what destroys a monopoly eventually, if it's not the government, is innovation. And the most important thing is innovation where you don't have to ask for someone or apply for someone before you invent something.
Like you don't have to ask the government for a license for a television station.
Right. Like if you want to invent a new radio device right now, you have to go to the FCC and say, can I do this? And blah, blah, it takes 50 years. If you want to start an internet company, a web company, you can still start a website. The question is whether in the new world where it's all about Apple apps or Facebook apps, do you need to go to those companies first to get permission? That is permissioned innovation, and that puts the monopolists in a position where they can destroy things that threaten them to protect their rule. They can eat their own children, overstating it a little bit, and destroy technologies that might challenge them. So it's very important not to let that happen.
Now, I described you as being someone that was a proponent of net neutrality. What does that mean, and how did you come to that feeling?
Right.
And how does that integrate with what you wrote in the book?
I have complicated feelings about government regulation because regulation is often something used to prolong monopoly rule and destroy competition. But I do believe you need some base rules, and one of them, it used to be called common carriage, it's now called net neutrality, is a rule that says anyone can run their business on the internet and there should not be discrimination by the people who carry the information. So I think that's an essential principle for permissionless innovation, for allowing the next innovation to come along and destroy the monopolist whose time has passed.
And so what's the future for all of us users of the internet? What do we need to be mindful of?
I think you got to watch and ask how many of the firms you use are monopolists. It's convenient. I use them all too. But we should be aware that we are creating monopolists by our very acts, by our preferences, and be aware of where the information you consume is coming from.
All right, I want to thank you very much, Tim Wu, the author of the new book, The Master Switch.